Just got to get the right angle so I can read what I've written. Okay, so this parable comes in the other Gospels, but each one gives a slightly different turn to it, or something else that we can learn. And I do like this one of written in Mark, but we have to take the context of this. What we've got to remember is that every day during this week leading up to Passover, Jesus, who was staying overnight at Bethany with the other disciples, and other people will have gathered there, come from Galilee and all around, getting ready for this festival. And it seemed to be that early each morning, Jesus went into Jerusalem and he spoke in the temple. And so the scene of this parable is in the outer court, or what is called the court of Gentiles in Herod's temple. And this is where Jesus would go to teach people. So people who weren't Jews would go, and this would be the only place that they could pray. But remember, and Amanda very graphically reminded us last night, that it was a really noisy place, because it's where they exchanged money so that people could then get their animals for sacrifice. And so it was a really busy, noisy space. Now, around one end of the court, there was a place called Solomon's Colonnade. And this was the place where teachers of the law, rabbis, would go. They would sit on a stool, and their disciples would gather around sitting on the floor. And so I'm sure that that was possibly where Jesus went, so that he could talk to his disciples, and other people will have gathered. You see, Jesus wasn't hiding. He knew what was going to happen. He knew that in a few days he was going to fulfill the promise of his Father. He didn't hide. He knew that the authorities were wanting to get him. You know, when he raised Lazarus, that almost was like the final straw, and we read on Sunday this, and at the end of this passage too, that the teachers of the law, the chief priests, the elders, the people who were in charge of the religious life, didn't like what Jesus was doing. So they decided that they would set traps for him. And just before this parable in Mark, in the end of chapter 11, we have recorded where the chief priests were asking Jesus on whose authority did he do all these things. Because he had been healing, obviously, he had been teaching, and they will have heard about Lazarus coming back to life. Now, Jesus doesn't tell them directly, and Mark records that this parable is his response. Now, what we need to remember is that a parable is a Jewish way of teaching. It was their culture to use parables in a way that other cultures at the time didn't. So these people who knew the Bible, they knew the Old Testament, because remember, if you were a teacher of the law, if you were an elder, you wouldn't just have learned the first 5 books of our Old Testament. You would have known a lot of, if indeed all of it, of what we call the Old Testament. And parables, as I say, was this very Jewish way of teaching. It's not just that it was an illustration of a teaching point. It was the teaching point. And so we have this parable, which I'm sure most of us here are familiar with. Now, what we have to remember is, because they knew the Old Testament, as soon as Jesus started talking about this parable, they would have known that it came from Isaiah chapter 5. The beginning of Isaiah chapter 5 is almost exactly the beginning of this parable, with the watchtower and the winepress and everything. And I'm sure that it got their attention. I'm sure that it got their attention, even if the disciples and other people around, who no doubt were listening, didn't know that passage. The chief priests and the elders and the scribes did. Now, Jesus' parable isn't the same as the one in Israel. In Isaiah, but the one in Isaiah is about judgment, and it is about Israel moving away from God. It's about Israel and the nation's sins. So in this one, we have very, very clear to people what it meant. So in Isaiah, the vineyard was Israel. It was really, really clear to them that the tenants were the religious leaders, that the servants were prophets, that the son was the awaited Messiah, and that the other tenants would be very, very threatening, because it meant not just those Jews who recognised Jesus, but Gentiles as well. And so Jesus, in this parable, his teaching point is, hey, you've had your warning, basically. This is about judgment. This parable is about judgment. You've had your warning, and this vineyard owner, obviously God, has got to the end of his tether, if you like, and he's going to do something about it. He's going to send his son. And there are going to be consequences. Now, clearly, the chief priests and the elders would not have been happy with this, because they would have been threatened. You see, they will have known just how many prophets God had sent. Over hundreds and hundreds of years, we have in the Old Testament not just the books of prophets, but in the history sections, prophets are named, who came to speak to Israel. They came at different times and for different reasons. But what was their message? Wasn't it always that Israel should return to Yahweh, should return to God? The first commandment, you shall worship only God. You shall worship no other God but me. Isn't it about them living lives of humility and justice and mercy? These themes come again and again in the Old Testament, don't they? See, that idea of judgment is there all the way through. But also the idea that God's going to do something about it. And they were waiting for the Messiah. We heard that on Sunday, didn't we? That, this was triumphal entry. Okay, it wasn't what they wanted, but they were expecting the Messiah to come. Now, when I was thinking about this, and actually I did this passage 5 years ago, I remembered, and it's one of the things that hit me then, so I'm saying it again. What hit me was that in Mark we get recorded that he didn't just send a couple of servants, he sent many servants. And it reminded me of Psalm 86:15. But you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Love that. I love that our God is slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And actually, that expression, slow to anger, abounding in love, comes 7 times in the Old Testament. From Exodus right up to one of the minor prophets. Sometimes it's about God's faithfulness, sometimes it's about God's forgiveness, but it's all about the fact that God is a God who judges us, but that within that there is always that way of forgiveness. There is that faithfulness of God that he's going to bring about. And he gave Israel so many opportunities to come back to him. And sometimes people did, and lots of times they didn't. But God is slow to anger and abounding in love. But Jesus is saying the time's running out, isn't he? He's saying the time's running out. And then I found something new this time, because the last bit about the capstone, and this really gave me goosebumps. Okay, so you've got the Old Testament, and after the Old Testament was set down, after the exile and with Nehemiah and Ezra, is when what we have as the Old Testament finally came in its present form. After that, Jewish rabbis and teachers would write like commentaries. And by the time of Jesus, it turns out that there was a Jewish tradition that this rejected stone was rejected to be part of the sanctuary of the temple. That's the innermost part of the temple where the Holy of Holies is. But instead was used for the porch, the way into the temple. Just want to read from Ezekiel 43. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east, the porch. Then his spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And we know that this is what the temple was all about, wasn't it? It was that place where God's presence came physically to dwell. And by this time, once a year, the high priest would go in to the Holy of Holies, have a belt with a chain attached to him in case he died. You know, it was something that it no longer was there a cloud over the temple, as there had been for much of the Old Testament. The temple is that symbol, not more the symbol of God's presence. And here Jesus is saying, well, he's the porch, he's the stone in the porchway, it's the way that we come into God's presence. A day or two later, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Now, he says that to the disciples, but, I don't think that he's making it unclear to the teachers of the law, because they knew the Old Testament. They knew what it was about. And here's Jesus declaring that he is the Messiah, basically, and they don't like it. And so as we finish up, is when they start to plot more actively, and we know what the end result is going to be. No spoiler alert there. You see, the current rulers of the time may not accept that Jesus was the Messiah. But God is faithful, and he is going to bring his plans to fruition, whatever happens. And that is about Jesus being the way to the Father. We know that in a few days after this, when Jesus dies on the cross, that curtain is really thick, several inches thick, gets torn from the top to the bottom, so that the way into the Holy of Holies, the way into the Father's presence, is there. We know that that's going to happen because we lived 2,000 years after it happened. But it was there for people to see. Martha, a few days before this, when Jesus went to and raised Lazarus, but before he did, she announced to Jesus that she knew he was the Christ. The disciples by now were beginning to realise that Jesus is Christ, Messiah. All of this speaks to me of God's faithfulness and to bring his promises and plans to fulfilment. So as we think about this week, as Jesus carried on with his mission, knowing what was going to come. Now, I don't know if you, like me, are a fan of The Chosen, but as I was preparing this, I just was in the first season, I think, and the disciples and Jesus are going, and they're going past to see the crucifixion. And Jesus doesn't shudder, but you get like a shudder in his eyes as he saw that and thinks, because Jesus was fully human as well as fully God. So Jesus knew what was going to happen, but he willingly, for us, went through what he did, because our God is compassionate and gracious. He's slow to anger, but he's abounding in love and faithfulness. And that's why we know a verse which a lot of you will have learnt like me, that God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, so that all who believe in him can have eternal life. And really this parable speaks about his coming Messiah, God's love in fulfilling his plan. Amen.